So I'm John Kornblum. I'm a trustee and very, very happy to welcome you here. Also like to welcome fellow trustees. One is going to be welcomed twice. Roger Cohen, who is a trustee as a speaker, and now Kathy Martin. Welcome very much. Many of our fellows are here this evening, and I'm very pleased that we also have such a large and interested group of listeners this evening. I think we're going to be in for a real treat. There is hardly anyone who can cover the subject that he's going to cover better than Roger Cohen have. First, I want to welcome you also to the John W. Kluge Lecture. John W. Kluge was a German-American who was very dedicated to the American Academy, and his lectureship has continued for several years, since 2004 when it was first instituted. The last Kluge visitor, to give an example of what his program includes, was Lucy Coe, judge of the U.S. District Court for the Northern California, who gave us a very, very interesting discussion on litigation in Silicon Valley, which is an issue of quite a great interest these days. Roger, who I've known for many years, is a trustee of the American Academy. He has other less important jobs. He's worked for the New York Times for a number of years and is now one of their really headline editorial page columnists, writing mostly about foreign affairs, but often about the interplay between foreign affairs and American society and European society. He's going to speak to us this evening on the topic which he's entitled R.I.P, Rest in Peace, for those of you who don't know that, the Postwar Order, 1945 to 1917. I'm glad 2017, sorry, right. I'm glad that you've extended it all the way to 2017. I thought you might have had it a little bit, finished off a little bit earlier. I first met Roger when he was writing in Bosnia, and I think I can say without any hesitation that it was his writing in the early years of the Bosnia conflict, which in fact defined things for people like me who were sitting in the State Department at that time and helped us understand what was going on there. He took another interesting job on another interesting day on the 11th of September 2001. You remember that date? He became the head of the foreign desk of the New York Times. And he had a few sleepless nights, I think maybe a couple of weeks of sleepless nights after that. But the paper won a record 7 Pulitzer Prizes for the coverage after that time. Roger is also known through a small but very exclusive group in Berlin as the world's greatest party giver. And when he was the New York Times correspondent here, if everybody wanted to be at his events. His house has never been rented since he left it. I don't know if it's because the neighbors didn't want to have anybody more there, or because it's a memorial to the evenings which took place there. But it's now just overgrown with weeds and things like that, and we'll see what's going to happen to it. Anyway, Roger, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for being a trustee of the Academy, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for that, John. It's always great to be back in Berlin. My wife and I did come here very reluctantly. We'd been comfortably ensconced in Paris for some years and did not immediately see the attractions of Berlin. But we ended up having an amazing time here, arriving in 1998, and I look back on it actually as one of the happiest times of my life. There were a lot of parties, there was a lot of dancing. I'd been in Paris for many years and had never really gotten to know the president or the prime minister. Within a few weeks of getting here, I'd been invited to a small gathering at Chancellor Schröder's house. I'd hit the town with the then foreign minister, Joschka Fischer. I'd gone out with Otto Schily, the interior minister, and they were all regulars at these parties that John described. So when people talk of the transparency and openness of the Bundesrepublik, it really began to mean something to me. It was a beautiful day today. It doesn't rain all the time in Berlin. I discovered that a while ago. Soft and peaceful, and I wandered down to the lakefront, and I saw a sign saying U.S. Army, Wannsee Harbor, and I looked across the lake, and something, as you all know, happened on the other side of the lake some decades ago, and I just thought about the incredible journey of this house. The academy came into being more or less corresponding with my Berlin years, and it's been a wonderful thing accompanying this house that and this academy that symbolize transatlantic partnership, something very dear to me, in this city that is the living emblem of what transatlanticism can achieve. Before I go on with my remarks, I would like just to acknowledge Gail Burt, our chairman, who wanted very much to be here and couldn't, and is a dear friend, Michael Steinberg, our president, who at the last could not be present either, and Cathy Martin, another dear friend, who's the widow of Richard Holbrooke, whose idea brought this institution into being. Well, those happy times in Berlin from 1998 to 2001 have given way to troubling times, and they remind me of the famous old Jewish cable, "Start worrying, details to follow." I will try not to depress you too much tonight. Allow me to begin by saying the post-world order dry phrase is personal to me. I was born in Europe, well, if you still call London part of Europe, after the staggering act of irrational self-harm that's known as Brexit, and I became an American. I live in Brooklyn, accent notwithstanding, but carry Europe in my bones. Europa, its rebirth was my generation's hope. My father and uncle were hoisted as young men in their 20s out of faraway South Africa to join the Allied war effort, Jewish kids summoned back from Africa to the continent my family had left in time. My uncle, Bert Cohen, of the 6th South African Armored Division, 19th Field Ambulance, gave me his war diary chronicling the Italian campaign. On July 21, 1944, he arrived in Monte Cassino, abandoned by German forces a few weeks earlier after repeated Allied assaults. He had this to say in his diary: "Poor Cassino, horror, wreck, and desolation, unbelievable, roads smashed and pitted, mines, booby traps, and graves everywhere. Huge shell holes, craters filled with stagnant slime, smashed buildings, hardly outlines remaining, a silent sight of ghosts and shadows. Pictures should be taken of this monument to mankind's worst moments and circulated through every schoolroom in the world." Well, that was the memento mori offered by my uncle, then 25 years old, and recently arrived in a bloody continent called Europe. He never saw the Lithuania his mother had left, land by then of dead Jews. Those pictures of Monte Cassino were not circulated, and the miracle and fragility of European peace is, I think, too often forgotten today. We succumb at our peril to amnesia. I was shaped by the second half of the 20th century. If I didn't end up doing what my dad and my uncle did, it's thanks to the interlocking, ocean-jumping institutions of the post-war order, whose demise I have posited in my title today. I try never to forget that. It was not only the Germans, you know, who enjoyed what Helmut Kohl called the blessing of late birth. In some way, every post-war European did, I among them. I lived in Berlin, as I said, from 1998 to 2001. I saw the capital return here after the sojourn in bland Bonn. The whole city was a construction site. Cranes hoisted the new, but the past was not erased, A united Germany needed its steady admonition. I witnessed the miracle. Germany unified within NATO, its borders no longer contested. The German problem that had given those thousands of US diplomats at the Bonn embassy sleepless nights for so long. John was probably among them at some point. When I lived here, I would cross the Polish border sometimes. Poland's close to Berlin, as Poles know, and long knew much too well. I had to pinch myself with the border near invisible to recall that these were bloodlands, in Timothy Snyder's phrase, the last resting place of millions. Yet here, only decades later, there stretched before me the tranquility that NATO and the European Union and statesmanship had brought. None of this would have happened without the Transatlantic Alliance, without the Berlin Airlift and the Marshall Plan, without the United States as a European power. Constancy and strength in pursuit of strategy are wearing on their opponents. This great academy is also about that, the constancy of bonds that over time bring healing and beauty and freedom. We're not talking about abstractions here tonight. We're talking about the shaping of a continent where free people are able to pursue happiness, indulge their imaginations, and fashion their fates in peace and security, rather than, as happens so often in Europe, refight old wars or be subjected to the totalitarian whim of the Soviet imperium. And it was not inevitable that things came out this way, nor is it fashionable in this ahistorical and frothy moment to recall them. Let it be said at the outset that my president, Donald Trump, knows nothing of history, and he cares even less. Since President Trump took office, I found myself recalling a poem by Wisława Szymborska, Polish poet, Nobel Prize winner. And if you will excuse the intrusion of literature on this geostrategic discussion, I would like to read a few verses to you. The poem's called The End and the Beginning. After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up, after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody rags. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic? It's not, and takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little, and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing. Nobody, I would suggest, has perfected the business of knowing as little as nothing quite as well as my president, Mr. Trump. Well, let me now try to define the world of Trump. What is Trumpism? As far as I can see, it's an exercise in distraction from or denial of facts. It's the fear-exploiting assemblage of an alternative reality, a form of collective gaslighting at Twitter speed. It's founded on the president's very strong, powerful, intuitive sense of how media and social media function today as limiters of attention spans. It seeks to achieve dominance through a whirlwind of individually meaningless but cumulatively manipulative statements. Somewhere at its core lies arbitrariness. Now, liberty depends on facts. When the distinction between truth and lies disappears, there's no basis for the rational discourse on which the organization of a free society depends. Without facts, disorientation spreads. This serves an autocratic leader or someone inclined toward autocracy. Disoriented people are more ready to accept a despot as sole font of truth. I am your voice. Remember, Donald Trump just over a year ago at the Republican convention. I am your voice. The president, a man of feral instincts, also exhibits a keen understanding of people's susceptibility to the autocrat's authority. A lesson learned, I think, through his command over a decade of huge TV audiences, the most successful show, The Apprentice, on American television. And that show built toward what? It built toward a frisson of cruelty. And that cruelty was delivered with the words, "You're fired." Adrenaline is all. Trump knows that in our age, velocity trumps veracity. And that's a good state of affairs for his manic personality. Like a child bully, he blurts. Like a child coward, he then ducks for cover, preferably behind a general, as now with his NFL outburst. "You're fired," that phrase again. He wants NFL coaches to use his phrase for players, most of them African Americans, who refuse to stand for the national anthem. Well, so much for free speech. You know, this academy is a non-partisan place. It is non-partisan, I would suggest, to stand up for the Constitution, the rule of law, and free speech. All of them treated, I think, with some contempt by my president. Now, believe me, I want to respect my president. I certainly don't want to badmouth him in another country. I'm a naturalized American, and I'm a patriot. The last thing I want to do is look at Mr. Trump and cringe. I've searched for a redeeming feature. Well, his children seem to love him. That is something. But the fact remains that he has besmirched with lies and petulance and race baiting, a lot of that recently, the highest office in the land. Now, I had an alarming experience last month that I'd like to tell you about. President Trump had lied about 2 phone calls. One was from the president of Mexico, and one was from the head of the Boy Scouts Association, congratulating him, supposedly, on the situation at the Mexican border and on the brilliance, the greatness. As you know, with President Trump, everything is the greatest, the biggest, the largest, including the crowd outside the Eiffel Tower, supposedly, when he was there with President Macron. The greatest speech ever given on foreign soil, he claims, the one he gave in Poland. That's what it's like with him. Well, the thing is, the calls, as you probably know, did not exist. They never happened. They were pure figments of his imagination. And then, asked if the president had lied, the White House press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, said, "I wouldn't say it was a lie." And you know what? I actually remember shrugging. It was the shrug that was terrifying. Because this is how autocrats, or would-be autocrats, cement their power. They wear you down. The lies just happen so often, you begin not to pay attention. They take you down the rabbit hole. They want you to read that 2 + 2 = 5, that old Soviet slogan from the 1920s. They want you to read that 2 + 2 = 5 and shrug. Well, if I have a message tonight, ladies and gentlemen, it is, please do not shrug. The president has held 8 rallies since he took office. At a recent one in Phoenix, he called the media very dishonest people. He led the crowd in a chant of CNN sucks. He attacked the failing New York Times. A dishonest president calls the media that report on his dishonesty dishonest for doing so. Well, this is where we are. He said of the Charlottesville violence, there is blame on both sides. He equated neo-Nazi bigots with blood on their hands and leftist protesters. For this president, it seems, they stand more or less on the same moral plane. So again, please, ladies and gentlemen, don't shrug. There is a lot at stake. I hear Isaiah Berlin reminding us of a truth about liberal democracy, of which the founding fathers, they of our checks and balances, were mindful. Berlin wrote, "The best one can do is try to promote some kind of equilibrium, necessarily unstable, between the different aspirations of different groups of human beings." Well, that's not sexy. Some kind of equilibrium is not what human beings immediately want to proclaim, embrace, or die for. It is, however, essential for the discourse of any liberal democracy. It saves lives. And the post-war transatlantic architecture has been and is about preserving this gift of freedom. Benjamin Franklin asked in 1787 what form of governance had been adopted replied, "A republic, if you can keep it. A republic, if you can keep it." And I would say that seldom in the ensuing 230 years or so has as much vigilance and watchfulness been needed to do just that, keep it. But you'll say, if President Trump is all noise, does he matter? If he's all hat and no cattle, who cares? Well, it is a tempting argument. There's no sign of the wall on the Mexican border. NATO, at least 3 or 4 days a week, is no longer obsolete. The one China policy has not been scrapped. The Iran nuclear agreement, which is working extremely well. If we could have something like the Iran nuclear agreement with North Korea, we'd be dancing in the streets. An accord that held North Korea back before it acquired a bomb had very intrusive international inspections and had got them to row back their program in almost every aspect. If we had that, we'd be very, very happy. We don't. North Korea has a bomb. And despite this, Donald Trump calls the deal the worst deal ever, the one with Iran. Still, it's still there. The United States Embassy is still in Tel Aviv. NAFTA hasn't been scrapped. And the decision to leave the Paris Climate Accord has not yet been put into effect. I saw President Macron last week in New York, and he seems to think that he might be able to persuade the president to reconsider that eventually. We'll see. So perhaps Defense Secretary Mattis and National Security Advisor McMaster have ring-fenced Trump's recklessness and ignorance and bellicosity. Maybe they've neutralized him in some way. And some of the loonier members of his entourage and cabinet have been fired or marginalized. Perhaps adults have taken charge. There are still those early morning tweets, of course, in which the child has his tantrum. But America First has not yet upended the world. Except that in a way it has. I think that a disaster is unfolding whose consequences for humanity and for decency will be substantial. Take what's just happened in Germany. Angela Merkel won, but hers was a bitter victory. And as I wrote in the Times, the twilight of her chancellorship has begun. And I think, certainly for somebody who lived here 20 years ago, the arrival in Parliament for the first time in decades of almost 100 members of a party that flirts with neo-Nazism, expresses pride in the Wehrmacht soldiers of World War II, and hails once more the German Volk in an exclusionary sense, constitutes a shattering of the political contours of the Republic, at least as I understood them. There'll be a before and an after this election. And that lurch came for many reasons. Look, Germany is still stable. Angela Merkel is chancellor. Nevertheless, this is an important change. And the lurch came for many reasons that I won't go into right now. Perhaps we can go into afterward. But I will note that it happened at a time when a race-baiting American president, Mr. Trump, has opened the way for everyone's inner bigot. Things are being said around the world that couldn't be said before. Forms of xenophobia, of bigotry, of homophobia. These things are out in the open, and shown contempt the president has for the most carefully nurtured and prodigious post-war child, the German-American alliance. So the AfD is not the creation of Trump, but when an American president can't quite find unequivocal words of condemnation for neo-Nazis, the ground shifts in the free world. Plenty of damage can be done short of nuclear winter. Gauland wants the Volk back, and to heck with the lesser beings who have joined the Bevölkerung. Trump wants a white-dominated America. Now, the United States often falls short. Shadows like Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo claim the American beacon. It's dimmed, only to shine again. Those checks and balances, as long as they are there, as long as they're preserved, are corrective. But America's claim to leadership is voided permanently if stripped of a moral component. So we have a problem these days. Words cascade from Mr. Trump's mouth, and they mean nothing, because when a man of moral emptiness tries to exhort a nation, or even the world, to moral greatness, the only thing communicated is pitiful, almost comical hypocrisy. The dignity of free people governed by the rule of law is, ladies and gentlemen, inextricable from the American idea. If the United States does not use its power to spread and safeguard liberty, it ceases to be itself. Yet here's a president who scoffed at NATO and the European Union, the very post-war foundations of that freedom. He's shown a cavalier disregard and contempt for our alliance. Pay up does not make America great and prosperous. The United States, as all the post-war decades shows, benefits when others benefit, allies benefit, and even non-allies from its backing. What else have we seen? Well, the president has yet to meet a strongman who does not elicit his sympathy, a multilateral organization that does not prompt his disdain, or a German chancellor he fails to insult. The Saudi king, Rodrigo Duterte, Vladimir Putin, all good. Angela Merkel, not so much. I hear that Merkel and Trump scarcely speak to each other these days, if at all. This is worrying. Germany is the most important country in Europe and a core American ally. We've seen the evisceration under the president of the State Department, a proposed 30% budget cut, countless critical posts unfilled, including the American ambassador to Germany, not yet arrived, a Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who has contrived somehow to be both ineffective and demoralize his entire staff. It's very simple in the end. Jim Mattis, now Defense Secretary, said it himself to Congress in 2013. If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Again and again we hear America first, that slogan of ugly fascist pedigree. But what can America first do for terrorism, or climate change, or the crisis presented by 65 million migrants on the move? As Macron told me last week in New York, we need to find a form of multilateralism in which President Trump has his place. Well, Macron does make extraordinary things happen. We saw that in France this year. But it's a tough assignment, a very tough assignment. Donald Trump hears the word multilateral, and he runs for cover. So I'm dubious. President Trump loves soldiers the way he loves a crunching football tackle. My hunch is he'd like to see a small to medium-sized war in which he can declare victory, because that for him would announce that America is back. We've seen his braggadocio in Syria, where a reprisal bombing, justified in my view and very belated, for the regime's use of chemical weapons, occurred in what was later revealed as an utter vacuum. No strategy, no tactic even, no follow-up, nothing. And then later a cabinet minister, Wilbur Ross, suggested it had occurred in lieu of after-dinner entertainment, as it coincided with the Mar-a-Lago dinner of President Trump with President Xi Jinping of China. A cruise missile strike as after-dinner entertainment, and President Trump calls Kim Jong-un a madman. Well, he should know. This is the unbearable lightness of being in Trump world. Now, Kim is a madman, and his regime a monstrosity, a corrupt pyramid scheme built on lies, a personality cult, and terror. But sounding off is not the way to confront him. That requires what I referred to earlier, constancy and strength and diplomacy in pursuit of strategy. Of this I see no sign. The thing about nuclear brinkmanship is that accidents can happen. When two thin-skinned men with nukes, grudges, and mysterious hair hurl insults at each other, and one of them is the American president, there is no cause for comfort. The world is more combustible than in many years. So, rest in peace, the post-war order, R.I.P. My title, of course, is a bit of a provocation. We've not gone over a cliff yet. There are men, and they are all men, around Trump who know the importance, the central importance, of our treaty alliances. Still, the 20th century fades from view, gradually, inexorably. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing. This is the way of the world. A new generation strides forth. The Cold War, not even a memory for them. They will forge something new, something perhaps unimaginable to most of the people in this room, myself included. That is right, and that is proper. But may the new be decent, and may the lessons of the first half of the 20th century never be forgotten. Trump's, I fear, is an age of indecency. Machismo, militarism, and mercantilism are no substitute for the American undergirding of global security. Of course, power shifts are happening. They were happening under President Obama, and I was critical of his foreign policy in many regards. And they're happening long predates Trump. But the way to manage the rise of China, the emergence of India, the revanchism of Russia, the predations of autocracy, is not through Twitter outbursts. It's through learning the lessons of our democracy's recent failings. Impunity for the rich and growing inequality don't work. It's through diplomacy. That requires an effective, not an eviscerated State Department, and respect for our allies, not least Germany. My deepest concern, along with the blurring of what is true and what is false, what is real and what is fake, is that Trump actually believes the post-war order was merely a means to rip off the United States. You know, he took out an ad in 1987 in my newspaper, the New York Times, a full-page ad. I don't know how many of you have read it. Exactly 3 decades ago in 1987. It said exactly the same thing. We're being ripped off. People are taking money from us. We need to restore our greatness. He is not going to change. If you imagine that office will change him, you are wrong. This is the way he is, and this is the way he has been for a long time. And that he buys, if anything, into Vladimir Putin's macho authoritarianism and spheres of influence for the great powers. Well, as the build-up to World War I showed, spheres of influence for the great powers is not the path to stability. It's dangerous, and it amounts to a dramatic break with American policy, as superbly articulated earlier this year by one of the many departing senior diplomats. A lot of senior diplomats have observed what's going on and decided this is enough for me, and they've left. So, in a sense, the State Department has been decapitated in many ways. And Daniel Fried joined the Foreign Service in 1977. He was ambassador in Poland. He served with great distinction, particularly in Central Europe. And he had this to say on his departure, and I think it's worth reading. Few believed that Poland's solidarity movement could win, that the Iron Curtain would come down, that the Baltic states could be free, that the second of the 20th century's great evils, communism, could be vanquished without war. But it happened, and the West's great institutions, NATO and the EU, grew to embrace 100 million liberated Europeans. It was my honor to have done what I could to help. I learned never to underestimate the possibility of change, that values have power, and that time and patience can pay off, especially if you're serious about your objectives. Nothing can be taken for granted, and this great achievement is now under assault by Russia. But what we did in my time is no less honorable. It's for the present generation to defend, and when the time comes again, extend freedom in Europe. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, values have power. Right now, we have something approaching a valueless foreign policy and approach the world emanating from the Oval Office. That is a very serious state of affairs. Now, Angela Merkel knows that, I think, that values have power. She did the right thing in 2015. History will vindicate her decision to allow in about 1 million refugees. If you doubt me, just say in 20 years' time, I heard it first from Cohen at the American Academy. You know, we columnists have to make predictions. Often we get it wrong every now and again. Well, unfortunately, I wrote that Donald Trump would probably win after Brexit, and I wish I'd been proved wrong. Germany knows what closed doors can mean to the persecuted. Being from a Jewish family, I do too. That also is in my bones. Merkel, raised in East Germany, knew it with a particular conviction, and so brought Europe back from the brink of mayhem. Perhaps her margin of victory would have been greater if she'd travel-banned the desperate. Perhaps littleness pays today. I doubt it in the German case. One lesson of its total annihilation was that a little man is capable of reducing the world to ruin. I trust and believe we can guard against that today, even in Trump's world. He too will pass in 1 year or 7 years, I know not. And incidentally, if I was betting on whether impeachment or a second term for President Trump were more likely, I would say a second term is more likely. I think both are unlikely, but I would put a second term at between 15 and 20% and impeachment at around 10%. And it's very important to be sober. It's very important to look the state of affairs in the face, however disagreeable that may be. If the Democratic Party, if we all don't learn from the arrogance, really, and the ignorance that played a role in Mr. Trump's election, then that would be a very serious omission. It's no good just looking away and thinking, well, you know, these people will grow up or they'll see the light. No. And by the way, nobody was ever persuaded by being made to feel stupid. But he will pass. As I said at the beginning, I'm of South African descent. As such, I can only be a creature of hope. Some of my most formative moments were spent in South Africa, the country in which my parents were born. Throughout my childhood and adolescence, catastrophe loomed. It was as inevitable as the sunset. The Johannesburg swimming pools of my relatives would run red with blood. Out of the distant, fetid townships, the black majority would rise up to claim what was theirs and avenge the cruel injustice of apartheid. My family and the other 4 million whites in South Africa would be chased out. Well, you know what? It didn't happen, ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the leadership of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. A miracle, like that invisible German-Polish border to which I alluded. Most miracles, of course, are not Xanadu-like flashes of illumination. They emerge from hard work. The resolution that kept the white community in South Africa grew out of hard work, and the realization that creating a decent future was more important than avenging the wounds of the past. And that invisible border grew out of the vision of post-war leaders in France and Germany and decades of hard work in building the European Union and then building it outward, rightly in my view, to take in the Central European and Baltic states. Well, we are working, in conclusion. The judiciary is holding the line against Trump's insults and manipulations, for example, saying that a judge of Mexican descent was not fit to preside in an American court. Some of these things are really unbelievable. To state the obvious, the United States is not Weimar. Its institutions are strong. And the press is fighting back. The New York Times and the Washington Post are going mano a mano with scoops that have already led to the sidelining or departure of several senior members of the Trump administration. The Russian imbroglio is being relentlessly untangled. A free press and Mr. Mueller are at work on that. Far from the failing fake news New York Times, we've in fact been invigorated. There are more than 600,000 new digital subscriptions to the New York Times this year. A whole new generation of millennial readers are discovering the fact that tough investigative journalism and the First Amendment are extremely important And that tough investigative journalism does not come free. And so they are ready to pay for it. And we are busy holding the presidency, the administration, to account. Steve Bannon, now departed, told the media to shut up. No, Mr. Bannon, we are not going to shut up. Everything about what I do has changed since I was filing by telex from a war-ravaged Beirut in the early 1980s. But the foundations, of journalism have not changed. And I would say the two foundations are bearing witness, and to bear witness, you have to be there, and holding authority, holding power to account. That is what we're about, despite all the changes, all the technological miracles, all the transformations in the profession. The essence of it is still the same. The rest, as Rabbi Hillel might have put it, is just commentary. And as we're on the eve of Yom Kippur in Berlin, here is Hillel's full 2,000-year-old observation. That which is hateful to yourself, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. The rest is just commentary. I mentioned at the beginning that old Jewish cable, start worrying, details to follow. Well, here are the details. Oy vey, phony in power, wants us chopped liver. We must fight for the transatlantic institutions, including the American Academy, that defend us from belligerent phonies. The institutions that have forged and preserve the bonds that keep the free world vibrant and safe and decent. If not now, when? As Albert Camus observed, the only way to fight the plague is with decency. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I'd be happy to take a few questions if, yes, sir.
Mr. Cohen, I wanted to ask you about the media now, the New York Times, the Washington Post. To what extent does their message reach these people who are the supporters of Mr. Trump, or don't they? Isn't one of the problems that they never read newspapers? They were not exposed to newspapers in many cases, not in all.
Yeah.
What do we do about that?
Well, thank you, sir. Did everybody hear the question? Did everyone hear the question? The question was, does the New York Times reach Trump supporters? Is there any point in doing what I do? Am I ever going to change anybody's mind? It was a very gentle question, but it was actually pretty devastating. I'm not sure I can even reply. I may just crack up and walk off this podium. And of course, I've asked myself the question as I sit down to write a column. And some of you may think, oh, 2 columns a week, that's a nice, cushy job. But of course, asking any human being to try to come up with 2 semi-original ideas a week is a lot to ask of anyone. And yes, there is this issue of preaching to the choir. It may be beautifully crafted. It may make wonderful points. It may be very incisive in its argument and observations. But does it change anybody's mind? And of course, that really is what you want to do more than anything if you're writing opinion. You want somebody to say, oh yeah, hadn't thought of that, hadn't looked at it that way. Maybe he's right. Maybe I could entertain that idea. And of course, there is less and less of that in our societies. I think it's probably true to some degree, even maybe quite a considerable degree, but not as much as in the United States, in Germany. And we're in our ideological canyons. It's become almost a cliche. We go to the networks or the websites that comfort us in the opinions that we already hold. Through social media, we get this adrenaline rush of being part of the same tribe, of building these viral moments when great anger or indignation is expressed, and it's a real problem. The red state, blue state divide is acute and very worrying. And we didn't do as good a job as we could have done in getting out before the election and really trying to understand the anger and fear that Steve Bannon intuited and of which Donald Trump became the voice with Mr. Bannon's assistance. We could have done better. Personally, I did get sick of sitting in New York and being at dinners and listening to my liberal friends trying to outdo each other in the funniest put-down of Mr. Trump, and I went down to Kentucky for a week, and it was on that basis that I concluded that he might well win. But we need to understand better what's going on. We need to treat people. Yes, there are racists, there are awful people, white supremacists among Trump's followers, but there are also a lot of decent, intelligent Americans who think differently. They think differently. They see the world differently. When you leave New York and you go to southern Indiana, I've been a foreign correspondent most of my life. It's a foreign correspondent experience. I mean, everything that you assume, you want me to think about climate change and I'm wrestling with my car payments. You don't think I should shop at Walmart and you shop at Whole Foods for all that organic stuff. And you want me to worry about choose your gender bathrooms, and you're telling me that gender is a spectrum, that they're not men and women anymore. There's some kind of spectrum there's a huge degree of non-communication. There's a huge cultural gulf, and it's important to hear those voices and talk. That's what the functioning of a democracy is about. Specifically on the media. I don't see any quick fix to the problem. I certainly think that Facebook was, way too late in getting to what really was an attempted Russian subversion of the election. And we need. One thing I do think is very important is to begin to teach media literacy at a whole new level in high schools and even in college. I mean, people are bombarded. If they don't receive at a relatively early age some kind of guidance into how you distinguish between fake news, some kid in Macedonia who's been paid $200 to create some story that puts Hillary Clinton down, and real journalism, that you can learn that to some degree, and that has to happen. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
With your experience in both the United States and Germany and Europe, I'd like to ask, let's assume that Trump lasts for only one term. How long do your instincts say it will take the American system to get the poison out? And how long do you think it'll take to get the poison out in Germany?
Thank you, madam. How long will it take to get the poison out if the president's is a single four-year term? Of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 3.5 years. We don't know if there is going to be a small to medium-sized war. We don't know to what degree his belligerent and bellicose instincts can be contained. And we don't know, there is the argument that there's so much incompetence, not much is going to get done. I mean, look what happened with healthcare. And the one deal he did make with the Dreamers was with the Democrats, much to the annoyance of the Republican Party. But we've seen things happen in the White House that hadn't happened before, and we've seen the office of the president really changed, I think, in a pretty fundamental way. I mean, everything that was solemn, inspiring, august even about it has been stripped from it, I think. A lot of people think differently. I was on an NPR show recently, and I was talking about some instances of President Trump being dishonest, and there were several calls came in from across the country saying President Trump is the most honest president we've ever had. I say, really? Why? Well, because he's doing exactly what he said he would do, and he speaks his mind. He just speaks out. It's not politically correct. He speaks out, he tells it like it is, and that's honest. So, there are completely different notions out there. I mean, this is the issue. We can argue about this podium. I mean, is it the right height? Is it wide enough? But we have to start when we argue about it about agreeing that it's a podium, right? This is a podium. I mean, we in the United States are now at a point where we don't agree that this is a podium, or we're getting close to it, and that that is very, very serious. I don't think. Let me think. I don't think it will. I don't think it will just wash out overnight, and. Especially because I think the issues that I've just described of the fracture in the country run very, very deep, and we're not going to get beyond them for quite a while. Does our whole electoral system need overhauling? Has gerrymandering got us to a point where representative democracy is no longer representative enough? I mean, these are very, very deep issues that I think we're going to be grappling with. Certainly for the next decade. And so I think some lasting damage has been done. In Germany, I think Germany, it's a turning point, what's just happened. And this will be Chancellor Merkel's last term. I believe in the stability of the Bundesrepublik. I don't think Germany is going to go off on some Sonderweg again. But I could see the FD, going to 17, 18%. There's something, I mean, I've become fond of quoting the Bob Dylan line. There's something happening here, but we don't know what it is. There's something happening here. I mean, there is something happening here. There's something going on. I mean, the right has the wind in its sails, and there is a rightist, nationalist, xenophobic, nativist reaction going on, and it's broad and it's big and it's full of vim and vigor, and liberals are on the defensive, and there are a lot of reasons, and there are probably some things we can't even imagine, but there's fear and there's anger. There's fear of globalization, there's fear of the future, there's fear about people's kids, there's anger at inequality, growing inequality, there's anger at impunity, there's anger at a sense that the system has been rigged by elites. There's a feeling of not being heard. There's a great gulf between the wired metropolis and the vast periphery. And I think we're just kind of at the beginning of this in a way, and I don't claim to fully understand it. I think all of you feel it in different ways. We've seen it in France with Marine Le Pen. We've seen it in Britain with this totally irrational act by a supposedly prudent country. I mean, at least Trump will end, I believe. Brexit's forever, and it's a disaster. Yes, you, sir, and then you, madam. Yeah.
Michael Backfish from the Funke Media Group. You said there might be an inclination of Mr. Trump starting a small to medium-sized war. Does this also apply to North Korea? And secondly, how moderate and realpolitik oriented are the generals in the White House, gentlemen, Mr. Mattis, Kelly, McMaster, and how influential are they now as Mr. Bannon has left the White House?
Well, the question was, would the small, medium-sized war be North Korea, and are the generals, like General Mattis or Kelly or McMaster, are they, to what extent are they moderate, and to what extent are they in charge of the situation today? Well, the thing with North Korea, of course, is it would pretty quickly, or could very quickly, go from small to medium-sized to pretty large. Anybody who's stood at the border, as I have, knows that it's a pretty short drive from Seoul up there, and presumably would be hit by artillery, North Korean artillery, pretty quickly if a war was to begin. And if that's the case, a capital city of many millions of people, under North Korean bombardment, casualties could very quickly rise, and that is one reason why it's such an intractable problem. But I think when you have the kind of insult hurling that's been going on between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, when you have the flights, when you have the President of the United States at the United Nations talking of the total and utter destruction, reduction to ashes of a country, North Korea, then clearly you're walking a fairly fine line. An accident could happen. There could be an incident, and then incidents, take the shooting of the Crown Prince in Sarajevo. It can escalate. The snowball can start rolling down the hill pretty quickly. So it is worrying. I mean, I think the chances of war in North Korea have gone up. I don't think they're higher than about maybe 20%, but they're 25%, but they're up there, and we don't know what Kim Jong-un is going to do. The Kim family obviously wants to retain the power it's had since World War II. The Chinese have a lot of skin in this game. As you know, Mao sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops across the river in 1950, when it looked like the United States and people in North Korea are taught that the war began with the South Koreans invading. The contrary, of course, is true. And Kim thought he could take the whole Korean peninsula. The United States came in, our forgotten war, 33,000 American dead. And we were heading north until the Chinese came in, and with massive casualties, several hundred thousand dead in the Chinese case, maintain the North Korean regime. So this is an investment. I mean, it's not. The North Koreans do not want a united Korea, U.S. treaty ally at its border. Nor do they like Kim Jong-un, but the naive way in which the president thought that after a dinner at Mar-a-Lago, Xi Jinping was going to do his bidding and resolve the situation. Well, it was pitiful, frankly. So, yeah, I mean, there's a possibility, and it would be likely to be devastating. Is there some way of decapitating the regime that's being contemplated? Probably. It's a pretty hawkish CIA right now, and a pretty hawkish president. So, who knows what surprise we could wake up to one day? I don't know. As for your second question, well, I think the departure, I don't think President Trump wanted Steve Bannon to go. I think General Kelly came in and he wanted to clean house. He wanted Scaramucci gone, obviously, after his foul-mouthed outburst. That's a pity. I mean, it would have been great fun to have. I would have liked to have Scaramucci for, I don't know, 6 weeks, 2 months. It would have been, it would have been a roller coaster. It would have been a real blast. But anyway, he was gone in 10 days. And then he wanted Steve Bannon gone, and he wanted that Hungarian nationalist over at the National Security Council, whose name I've forgotten. Yes, thank you. He wanted him gone too, and they're all gone. So that, I think clearly the president, and again, I said he has feral instincts. I think he sensed that things with Scaramucci. And why did he hire Scaramucci against the advice of everyone? Because he thought he looked really sharp on Fox TV, and he liked his suits, and he thought he cut a suave figure, and so he hired him, and what happened. I think I think they, generals know what wars are like, to state the obvious, and certainly General Matt, his statement recently about learning from our allies was very welcome. And I think Mattis is hawkish on Iran because he was in Iraq and he saw soldiers killed by Iranian fabricated, manufactured IEDs, and so he's pretty hawkish on Iran. But you know, these are not wild men at all. I mean, I think they will. Yeah, I think if we haven't had a really bad incident in North Korea, it's testimony to their influence, and I think their influence is very important. Now, will President Trump settle down? Will the team that he has now be his team for a while? Again, one doesn't know. I wouldn't be surprised if Rex Tillerson is gone within the next 6 months. He's a very, in my view at least, ineffective Secretary of State. Pardon? Steve Miller, what about him? Yeah, Steve Miller. He's there too. Steve Miller is there, writes those great speeches. Steve Miller is he's he's really in the American First xenophobic school, and but he's a smooth operator, and I don't know, he might survive for a while, I think. Trump likes him a lot. Yes, it was you, madam.
Thank you. With the growing gulf in American opinion between, we could call them Republicans and Democrats, or conservatives and liberals, whatever you want to call it. But it's been growing this way in the past 3 or 4 decades. It's clear. It's not something new. And of course, it's geographically based as well. We can talk about red states and blue states. So I'm interested to hear your opinion, since prophecy seems to be part of the job of a reporter, to consider the possibility that the unitedness of the United States may be changing in the next century or so. Can you imagine that we will no longer be 50 states, but some 2 republic things?
So the question was,
It's
will the
provocative.
unitedness of the United States cease to be, and will it crack up? Yeah, I'm not sure my prophesiers, my crystal ball runs that far, and if it were to happen, I think I wouldn't be around to see it. But there's no question that, you know, the secession movement in California is not totally negligible at the moment, and things like President Trump's decision on the climate accord in Paris certainly fuel that. And states are going their own ways on climate. They're not listening to the White House. They're not abrogating Paris or cutting their programs to develop electric cars or all the other things that states are doing in the United States. And sanctuary cities as well, thank you, yeah. You know, we fought one civil war with a massive toll, and as we've seen in recent weeks and months, the civil war's still there in some form, and we've been arguing as Americans over the Confederate statuary and where and when and whether it should be removed. And you know, having covered the war in Bosnia, that's where I learned how deep these historical wounds go, and how, if they're suppressed, they may seem to have disappeared, but they resurface, and how the stories of what happened to families and family members, ancestors, how they are transmitted down through the generations. They're transmitted by stories that people tell each other, but I think they're also transmitted in the blood. That might sound strange, but I think it's true, and so I think that wound is present in the United States, and I would suspect that if we ever got to that point, that historical memory of what we fought for and sacrificed as Americans to keep this experiment in governance of the people, by the people, for the people, alive, as President Lincoln, of course, put it. that sacrifice would resurface in some way and prevent or head off some act of folly. In the same way as I believe that here in Germany, we are further and further from the horror of the Holocaust and of the Third Reich. But they're present, you know, they're present in young Germans, they're present through knowledge of what forebears may or may not have done, through stories that were told, through blood, through a kind of osmosis. And, you know, it was hard coming here as a Jewish family, and my then wife, her grandmother and all her maternal family had been killed by the Nazis in the Krakow area. But we had a wonderful experience here in Germany, and I'd never really considered the Holocaust from the German side, how young Germans had grappled, still grapple with what happened and how difficult it was to come to terms with that. So in the same way, I believe that, you know, this history in Germany, if ever there was, you know, some strange, you know, rightist or nationalist temptation, no. I mean, Germany will not go there again. It's over. Some other country might, God forbid, but Germany won't. So I guess that's my answer. Yeah. I think, Jan, I'd take the audience rather than, yeah.
Hi. Can you predict at least one unpredictable good outcome of Trump?
The markets are up.
Just a second.
Everyone's looking at their 401ks and saying,
I'm Israeli,
yeah.
so that's a hint.
Yeah. What kind of hint? What kind of hint? I'm serious. I mean, our ambassador to Israel just said today in an interview that the settlements are part of Israel. I don't know what your political allegiance is, but in my view, that is extremely unhelpful, dangerous. And for our envoy to Israel to be saying things like that, and for at the same time, the White House to be talking about a deal between Israelis and Palestinians, it is completely and utterly farcical and ludicrous and, in fact, insulting. So yeah. Anything good? Yeah, as I said, well, markets are up. Who knows how long that'll last? Markets seem to like him. You know, he clearly, his cabinet's composed of the rich. He himself is rich to some degree. We don't know because we haven't seen his tax returns. But he wants to pursue policies that will help the rich, and I think markets generally like that. So there's that. I think, I mean, more seriously, you know, I think it's a wake-up call. I mean, I think, you know, our democracies were not functioning well. You know, to have had the Iraq War and to have had the financial collapse, implosion of 2008, to have had the Euro crisis here in Europe, and in every case, really, to have seen the powerful, you know, walk away. I mean, that degree of impunity was, of course, noticed by people. I mean, people aren't stupid. I'm a big believer in the ballot box. I mean, people look around, they think, and they go and vote. And you know, this extraordinary growth in inequality, particularly in Britain and in the United States, this failure to pay attention to how troubling globalization has been for many people, creating jobs, millions of them in places like China and Vietnam, where my son lives, but a corresponding loss of jobs in certain areas of the United States and elsewhere. And you know, to just say, as I said briefly in my remarks, to just say blithely, you know, these people are stupid, or they, you know, okay, it was just an aberration that we got Donald Trump, or just an aberration that we got Brexit, that's not enough. So in that sense, I think Donald Trump is forcing a reflection on what is working in our democracies, what is not working, what we need to try to address. And to end on an optimistic note, he has, I think, the combination of his election and Brexit has reignited, to some degree, the European idea. And Europe that had just been drifting, really, there's awareness that we have something valuable here. We have something really important. And if we lose it, we'll really regret it. You know, the European Union has been a peace magnet. It's what's made this continent tranquil and stable and prosperous. And it's the reason, as I said, why I haven't done what my dad did and my uncle did. And I think with Emmanuel Macron and his 100-minute speech, at least I didn't subject you to that, not quite, and Angela Merkel, perhaps something can be done on various fronts, and he's stimulated that. And I'll tell you in conclusion that the happiest I've been, my single happiest moment in my work this year was being in Paris and seeing the Macron-Le Pen, Marine Le Pen debate. And I thought that Macron had taken a huge risk by coming out so strongly for Europe. I mean, at that time, it seemed to be fatal to be strongly supportive of Europe, but he did, and all power to him. So the debate came around to the euro, and Madame Le Pen's plan to take France out of the euro and eventually take France out of the European Union. And she was asked to explain how she would go about this. And she started blabbering. And she went on blabbering in a completely incoherent way for about 7 minutes. And Emmanuel Macron was just sitting there watching this live suicide on TV. And live political suicide. And then finally she stopped. And he looked at her and he said, Madame Le Pen, c'est du n'importe quoi. And she went red, and that was it. Madame Le Pen, c'est du n'importe quoi. And it was over, and Europe had won the French election for Mr. Macron. Thank you.